addition, labor rights vulnerability involving SMS reflects a broader challenge. In the current international human rights framework, international standards are often designed with large multinational corporations in mind, assuming a level of institutional capacity, compliance mechanisms, and corporate governance structures that many SMEs simply do not possess. This mismatch between international expectations and the operational reality of SMEs creates a structural blind spot in global human rights governance. While SMEs are deeply embedded in global supply chains, their role as subcontractors or centrally suppliers often places them outside direct international scrutiny and accountability. Furthermore, responsibility for labor rights protection in global supply chains is frequently fragmented across multiple actors and relationships. This fragmentation makes it difficult to clearly identify who should be held accountable when labor rights violations occur. As a result, workers employed by SMEs may face heightened vulnerability, despite the existence of international labor and human rights norms. From an international perspective, this situation highlights the limits of a governance model that relies primarily on state enforcement and voluntary corporate compliance. When states lack capacity or political willingness to regulate labor practices effectively, and when international mechanisms lack binding authority over non-state actors, labor rights protection becomes inconsistent and uneven. Therefore, labor rights vulnerabilities in global supply chains should be understood not only as a problem of implementation, but also as a reflection of deeper structural challenges. Within international human rights governance, recognizing these challenges is important for evaluating the effectiveness of international human rights protection as a whole, without addressing the role of SMEs and the regulatory gaps they face. International labor rights standards risk remaining aspirational rather than practical. In this sense, the case of SMEs in global supply chains demonstrates why human rights at the international level must be viewed as a dynamic and evolving system. As global production networks continue to expand and diversify, international human rights governance must adapt to ensure that labor rights protection extends beyond large corporations and reaches all actors involved in global economic activity. Human rights are often described as universal and fundamental. At the international level, they are supported by global norms, institutions, and shared moral values. However, in practice, human rights protection remains uneven, especially in global economic activities. This presentation focuses on labor rights vulnerability in global supply chains, with particular attention to small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, at the international level. Rather than discussing human rights in general, this presentation refines the topic by examining how labor rights are affected when SMEs participate in global supply chains under international human rights frameworks. To begin with, it is important to understand how human rights operate at the international level. Unlike domestic human rights protection, which relies on national laws and courts, international human rights depend on international norms, institutions, and cooperation between states. International labor and human rights standards are often expressed through declarations, conventions, and guiding principles. Some of these instruments are legally binding, while many function as soft law, relying on voluntary compliance rather than strict enforcement. As a result, the effectiveness of international human rights protection largely depends on state willingness and institutional capacity, which creates challenges when addressing labor rights violations across borders. Global supply chains involve multiple actors operating in different countries. While multinational corporations usually receive the most attention, SMEs play an increasingly important role as subcontractors, suppliers, and service providers. However, SMEs are often overlooked in international human rights discussions. Many SMEs lack awareness of international labor standards and have limited resources to implement human rights policies. At the same time, international governance frameworks tend to focus on large corporations, creating regulatory gaps. This situation makes labor rights violations more likely to occur, particularly in sectors with weak regulation and intense cost pressure. Labor rights vulnerabilities in global supply chains can take different forms. These include excessive working hours, low wages, unsafe working conditions, and limited access to social protection. At the international level, frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights emphasize corporate responsibility to respect human rights. However, these principles are mostly voluntary and lack strong enforcement mechanisms, especially for SMEs operating across borders. As a result, labor rights protection in global supply chains remains inconsistent, and accountability is often unclear. In conclusion, labor rights vulnerability in global supply chains highlights a key limitation of international human rights governance. Although international norms and frameworks establish important standards for the protection of labor rights, their practical implementation remains uneven, particularly when small and medium-sized enterprises are involved. This gap exists because many international human rights mechanisms rely heavily on voluntary compliance, soft law instruments, and state cooperation. For SMEs operating across borders, limited resources, lack of awareness, and weak regulatory oversight further reduce the effectiveness of international labor rights protection. As a result, labor rights violations are not necessarily caused by the absence of norms, but by structural weaknesses in international governance, including fragmented responsibility, limited enforcement, and insufficient attention to smaller economic actors. This situation demonstrates that human rights at the international level should not be understood as a finished or fully effective system. Instead, international human rights governance is an ongoing process, shaped by economic pressures, institutional constraints, and evolving global production networks. Understanding the role of SMEs in global supply chains is therefore essential. By recognizing how smaller enterprises contribute to labor rights